Gunshots shattered the midnight rain. A bleeding police officer was pinned behind a burning cruiser, seconds from execution. Most people would have driven away. But a desperate single father and his rescue dog didn't just stay, they ran straight into the crossfire, uncovering a secret that would shake the city. The relentless Seattle rain hammered against the windshield of David Miller's rusted 2008 Ford F-150, the wiper blades fighting a losing battle against the deluge. It was past midnight on a Tuesday, and the industrial district of Sodu was a ghost town of towering brick facades and vacant loading docks. David gripped the worn steering wheel, his knuckles white, fighting the heavy pull of exhaustion that settled in his bones. He was 32, but the deep lines around his eyes made him look 10 years older. Working a double shift at the shipyard, followed by 3 hours of gig economy delivery driving, had hollowed him out. But every time the fatigue threatened to pull his eyelids shut, he thought of 7-year-old Sarah. She was asleep at Mrs. Higgins' apartment across town, waiting for her father to pick her up. Since his wife passed away 3 years ago from a sudden, aggressive illness, it had just been David, Sarah, and the crushing mountain of medical debt that followed them like a shadow. He was a man running on fumes, sustained only by the desperate need to keep a roof over his daughter's head. Sitting in the passenger seat, oblivious to the financial burdens of the human world, was Barnaby. A 70-pound mix of German Shepherd and something undeniably stubborn. Barnaby had his head resting on the edge of the window, his wet nose twitching as he took in the damp, metallic scents of the city. David had found the dog tied to a chain-link fence behind a grocery store 2 years ago, starved and skittish. Now, Barnaby was a solid wall of muscle and loyalty, fiercely protective of Sarah and perfectly in tune with David's every mood. "Almost home, buddy," David muttered, his voice hoarse. He reached over, scratching the thick fur behind the dog's ears. Barnaby let out a low, rumbling sigh and leaned into the touch. David took a sharp left onto First Avenue South, planning to cut through the warehouse district to save 10 minutes on the commute. The streetlights here were sparse, casting long, menacing shadows across the slick pavement. It was a route he took often, a quiet stretch of road where the only sounds were usually the hum of his failing transmission and the distant horn of a freight train. Tonight was different. The silence was abruptly, violently torn apart by a sound that made David's blood run cold. It started as a sharp, rhythmic popping like heavy firecrackers before escalating into the unmistakable, terrifying roar of automatic gunfire. David slammed his foot on the brake pedal. The heavy truck fishtailed on the wet asphalt, the anti-lock brakes grinding in protest before coming to a shuddering halt in the middle of the intersection. Barnaby was instantly alert, a low, menacing growl vibrating in his chest, the hair on the back of his neck standing straight up. "Stay down," David hissed, throwing his arm across the dog's chest. He killed the headlights, plunging the cab of the truck into darkness, and peered through the rain-streaked windshield. About 100 yards down the road, bathed in the flashing, frantic strobe of red and blue lights, a nightmare was unfolding. A standard-issue Seattle Police Department interceptor was parked diagonally across the street, smoke billowing from its shattered engine block. The driver's side door was flung open, completely riddled with bullet holes. The glass was entirely blown out, glittering like diamonds on the wet road. Beyond the cruiser, 3 black SUVs were positioned in a tactical blockade. 4 men, clad in heavy, unmarked tactical gear and wearing dark balaclavas, were advancing on the squad car. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that screamed military training. This wasn't a random gang shootout or a traffic stop gone wrong. This was a highly coordinated, professional hit. David's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His first instinct, the primal, undeniable urge of a father, was to throw the truck into reverse, floor the accelerator, and get back to Sarah. He had no business here. He was unarmed, exhausted, and solely responsible for a little girl who had already lost one parent. But then, illuminated by the harsh glare of a street lamp, he saw her. Pinned behind the rear tire of the destroyed police cruiser was an officer. The uniform was torn, and dark blood was pooling rapidly on the wet asphalt beneath her leg. She was gripping a standard-issue sidearm, returning fire with measured, desperate precision, but she was pinned down. She was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely cut off from escape. One of the masked assailants was flanking her, moving quietly along the brick wall of the adjacent warehouse, raising a suppressed rifle to deliver the final, lethal shot. David squeezed his eyes shut. "Sarah needs you," a voice screamed in his head. "Drive away. Pick up your daughter." He opened his eyes. The officer fired twice more, but the slide of her weapon locked back. Empty. She dropped the magazine, patting her tactical belt with frantic, blood-slicked hands, but she had nothing left. She looked up, the flashing police lights illuminating a pale face streaked with soot and rain. Barnaby let out a sharp, urgent bark, his front paws hitting the dashboard. The dog wasn't cowering. He was staring directly at the flashing lights, his entire body tense like a coiled spring. "God forgive me," David whispered. He didn't reverse. He didn't flee. With a sharp twist of the key, the F-150's engine roared to life. He slammed his hand onto the headlight switch, blinding the street with his high beams, and stomped the gas pedal to the floorboards. The heavy Ford truck surged forward like an angry steel beast, its V8 engine screaming in protest. The sudden eruption of light and noise caught the masked assailants completely off guard. "Barnaby, get down!" David roared over the engine noise. He ducked low below the steering wheel, peeking just over the dashboard to keep the truck aimed at the flanking shooter. The man with the suppressed rifle turned, his eyes widening behind the black fabric of his mask as the rusted grill of the F-150 barreled toward him at 40 miles an hour. He raised his weapon to fire at the windshield, but he was too late. David clipped the man with the heavy steel bumper, sending the shooter spinning into the brick wall of the warehouse with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed, his rifle clattering across the pavement. David slammed on the brakes, turning the wheel hard to slide the truck sideways, positioning the massive steel body of the F-150 directly between the trapped officer and the remaining 3 gunmen. Bullets immediately slammed into the side of the truck. The sound was deafening, a terrifying, percussive hammering that shattered the passenger side window and sent shards of glass raining down on the seats. The truck rocked on its suspension with every impact. "Hey! Hey!" David yelled, kicking his door open and diving out onto the wet pavement, scrambling on his hands and knees toward the back of the cruiser where the officer was pinned. He reached her just as a fresh volley of bullets tore through the air, sparking against the rim of the police car. "Are you hit? Can you move?" David shouted over the chaos. Up close, the officer didn't look like an ordinary street cop. Her tactical vest fit perfectly, but beneath it, David caught a glimpse of a tailored silk shirt, utterly ruined by mud and blood. On her wrist, exposed where her uniform jacket had torn, was a watch that David recognized from a magazine he'd once read in a waiting room, a Patek Philippe, worth more than his life insurance policy. Her nameplate read Sterling, but it was hastily pinned. Victoria Sterling gritted her teeth, pressing a hand tightly against a deep laceration on her thigh. She was 34, with sharp, aristocratic features currently masked by pain and shock. She wasn't supposed to be here. As the CEO of Sterling Defense Solutions, one of the largest private military and tactical supply contractors in the world, she had insisted on a frontline ride-along to field test a new line of proprietary body armor. Only the police commissioner and the precinct captain knew she was in the car. It was supposed to be a quiet patrol. Instead, someone had sold her out. "I can't put weight on my left leg," Victoria gasped, her eyes locking onto David. She expected panic in this civilian's eyes, but instead, she saw a hardened, terrifying calm. "Who the hell are you?" "My truck is running." David ignored her question, calculating the distance to his open driver's side door. "I'm going to grab you under the arms. On 3, we move. I'll cover you." "They have armor-piercing rounds," Victoria warned, her voice tight with pain. "You step out there, they'll cut you in half. They aren't street thugs. They're professionals." "So am I," David lied, adrenaline entirely taking over his nervous system. 1, 2. Before he could hit 3, the rear window of his truck exploded outward. A 70-pound blur of fur and fangs launched itself from the cab of the F-150. Barnaby hadn't stayed down. The dog hit the ground running, tearing across the wet asphalt with terrifying speed. One of the gunmen had broken formation, attempting to rush the truck to get a clear angle on David and Victoria. He never saw the dog coming. Barnaby launched himself through the air, his jaws snapping shut on the gunman's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The man screamed, a high, panicked sound, as the heavy dog brought him crashing down to the pavement. The assault rifle clattered uselessly away as Barnaby aggressively shook his head, pinning the screaming mercenary to the ground. "Three!" David roared. He hooked his arms under Victoria's tactical vest and hoisted her up. She grunted in agony but pushed off her good leg, hobbling furiously as David practically carried her through the rain. Bullets snapped the air around them, whining off the wet pavement like angry hornets. One round grazed David's shoulder, tearing through his cheap work jacket and searing his skin like a hot iron. But he didn't stop. He shoved Victoria into the driver's side of his truck, pushing her across the bench seat, and scrambled in after her. "Barnaby, here!" David screamed at the top of his lungs. Hearing his master's command, the shepherd mix released the bleeding mercenary, spun around, and sprinted back toward the truck, leaping through the open driver's door just as a bullet struck the metal door frame inches from his tail. David slammed the door shut, threw the truck into drive, and stomped the gas. The F-150's rear tires spun wildly on the wet asphalt before catching traction. He didn't bother turning the headlights back on. He navigated purely by the ambient light of the street lamps, tearing down the road away from the ambush. Behind them, the distant wail of a dozen police sirens suddenly pierced the night. Backup was finally arriving. Inside the cab, the air was thick with the smell of wet dog, copper blood, and gunpowder. Victoria was slumped against the passenger door, breathing heavily, her hands slick with her own blood. Barnaby was pacing across the back seat, whining anxiously, periodically licking the side of David's face. David glanced at his rearview mirror, ensuring they weren't being followed, before looking over at the woman bleeding on his seat. "Are you going to make it?" he asked, his voice shaking now that the immediate adrenaline was beginning to recede. The pain in his shoulder was suddenly burning white-hot. Victoria looked at him, then at the massive dog whining in the back. She had spent the last 10 years surrounded by elite private security, heavily armed bodyguards, and armored vehicles. Yet, when the true test came, a tired man in a rusting pickup truck and a mutt from the pound had saved her life. "Take a left on 4th Avenue, Victoria said, her voice dropping into an authoritative, commanding tone that did not belong to a beat cop. "Do not take me to a hospital. Take me to the Sterling Tower downtown. There's a private medical facility on the subterranean level." David frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Lady, you're a cop. You need a trauma center, and I need to file a report. I just ran over a guy." Victoria reached into her vest, pulling out a solid black, encrypted smartphone that was definitely not standard police issue. She tapped a few buttons, and the screen illuminated her face. "I am not a cop," Victoria said softly, her sharp eyes meeting his. "My name is Victoria Sterling, and whoever just tried to kill me tonight owns half the police force you're trying to report back to. If you take me to a public hospital, we will both be dead before morning." David stared at her, the rain drumming relentlessly against the roof of the truck. He thought of little Sarah, waiting for him. He had just stepped out of a simple, hard life into something infinitely darker and far more dangerous. "Hold on," David said grimly, cranking the steering wheel hard to the left. The towering silhouette of the Sterling Defense Solutions headquarters pierced the low-hanging Seattle clouds, an imposing monolith of black glass and steel. Following Victoria's strained directions, David navigated his battered F-150 down a narrow, unmarked alley behind the skyscraper. As they approached a solid concrete wall that looked like a dead end, Victoria pressed a sequence into her encrypted phone. With a deep, subterranean rumble, a section of the concrete seamlessly retracted, revealing a starkly lit, pristine underground ramp. David drove down into the belly of the corporate fortress, the rusting muffler of his truck echoing loudly against the polished epoxy floors. They were immediately met by a team of 6 individuals in charcoal tactical gear, their weapons lowered but ready. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a military buzz cut sprinted toward the truck as David shifted into park. "Medical! Now!" The man barked into a headset, yanking the passenger door open. He looked at Victoria's blood-soaked leg, his jaw tight. "Miss Sterling, we lost your transponder signal 20 minutes ago. We assumed the worst." "I was jammed. Brody." Victoria winced as Brody Hayes, her chief of security, helped her out of the ruined truck. The ride-along was a trap. They knew my route, they knew my comms frequency, and they had armor-piercing rounds. Brody's eyes snapped to David, who was climbing out of the driver's side, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Barnaby leaped out right behind him, his fur matted with rain, and the blood of the mercenary he had mauled. The dog let out a low, warning growl at the heavily armed security team. "Stand down, Barnaby," David rasped, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He looked at Victoria. "Who are these people?" "They are the only people in this city I can trust," Victoria said, grimacing as two trauma nurses with a mobile gurney hurried out of the adjacent elevator bay. She looked at Brody. "This man and his dog just took on a heavily armed hit squad to pull me out of the crossfire. Treat him with the utmost respect and get a doctor to look at his shoulder." 10 minutes later, David found himself sitting on a sterile, stainless steel examination table in a private, state-of-the-art medical wing buried 5 stories beneath the city. A surgeon, Dr. Linus Gallagher, had efficiently cleaned and stitched the graze on his shoulder, injecting him with a local anesthetic and a heavy dose of antibiotics. Barnaby sat obediently at David's feet, gnawing on a premium, freeze-dried beef bone one of the security guards had nervously offered him. Victoria was in the next bay, separated by a glass partition. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of her thigh, missing the femoral artery by a fraction of an inch. Now dressed in dark medical scrubs, she limped into David's room, leaning heavily on an aluminum cane. Brody followed closely behind her, carrying a sleek tablet. "You're a long way from the shipyards, Mr. Miller," Victoria said softly. While he was being treated, Brody had run his fingerprints through their private database. A widowed father, deep in medical debt, working 2 jobs. "You had absolutely no reason to risk your life for a stranger tonight." "You were a cop bleeding out in the street," David said, his voice flat, still processing the sheer surrealism of the night. "Or, at least, I thought you were. I wasn't going to let my daughter grow up in a world where people just drive away from that." Victoria's expression softened, a flicker of genuine respect crossing her sharp features. "For what it's worth, David, I am deeply grateful, but your bravery has just pulled you into a war." She gestured to Brody, who handed David the tablet. On the screen was a dossier belonging to Richard Blackwood, the Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Defense, alongside Deputy Commissioner Sullivan Reed of the Seattle Police Department. Sterling Defense manufactures the tactical gear for over 40 major police departments across the country, Victoria explained, her tone turning icy and businesslike. 3 weeks ago, I uncovered a massive discrepancy in our manufacturing ledgers. Blackwood has been quietly swapping our military-grade ceramic plates with cheap, substandard knockoffs, skimming millions off the top. The defective armor was being funneled directly to the Seattle PD. David looked up from the tablet, realization dawning. "And the real armor?" "Sold on the black market to cartel syndicates," Brody interjected, his voice a low gravel. "Miss Sterling was gathering the final evidence to present to the FBI tomorrow morning." Deputy Commissioner Reed is Blackwood's inside man. Reed organized tonight's ride-along to field test the gear, deliberately assigning Miss Sterling to a patrol route that was completely isolated. "The hit squad tonight wasn't a gang," Victoria said, leaning heavily on her cane. "They were Blackwood's off-the-books mercenaries, dressed as street operators. They were supposed to execute me and frame it as a random, tragic act of urban violence. With me dead, Blackwood takes control of the board and Reed covers up the investigation." David's blood ran cold. The adrenaline that had kept him going abruptly evaporated, replaced by a deep, suffocating panic. He looked down at his muddy work boots. "My truck," David whispered, the color draining from his face. "When I hit the gas, I left the truck idling in the street under the streetlight before I rammed them. They had a clear view of the back." Brody frowned. "What are you saying, Miller?" "My license plate." David stood up so fast the stool clattered to the floor. Barnaby dropped his bone, instantly alert. "It's registered to my name, to my address, my daughter, Sarah. She's at a babysitter's apartment 3 miles from here. If they run my plates through the corrupt police database, they'll know exactly who you are and who you love," Victoria finished, horror flashing in her eyes. Brody was already tapping his earpiece. "Comms room, I need a trace on a 2008 Ford F-150 license plate." "No time," David pushed past the doctor, grabbing his torn, blood-stained jacket. "I have to go. Now." "You can't go in that truck," Victoria commanded, stepping into his path. She looked at Brody. "Prep the armored SUV. We are going with him." "Miss Sterling, you are injured, and there is a heavily armed hit squad looking for you," Brody protested. "It's protocol to lock down." "To hell with protocol!" Victoria snapped, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "This man saved my life when he had nothing to gain. I am not going to let his little girl pay the price for my company's corruption. Arm up, Brody. We are going on the offensive." The rain had intensified into a torrential downpour, flooding the gutters of the city. A matte black, heavily armored Cadillac Escalade tore through the deserted streets of downtown Seattle, ignoring every red light. Brody was behind the wheel, driving with terrifying, calculated aggression. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, an automated compact submachine gun resting across her uninjured leg. David sat in the back, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. He had a loaded Glock 19 resting on his thigh, a gift from Brody before they left the garage. He had fired a handgun twice in his life at a range, but the cold weight of the metal was the only thing keeping his sheer terror at bay. Barnaby sat beside him, the dog's large head resting heavily on David's knee, offering silent, steadfast comfort. 2 minutes out, Brody announced, taking a sharp turn that threw David against the leather door panel. "Address is 442 Grover Street, apartment 3B, second floor." "What's the play?" Victoria asked, her eyes scanning the dark streets ahead. "We go in fast, grab the girl and the babysitter, and we extract back to the safe house," Brody said. "If we meet resistance, we neutralize it. I have a 4-man tactical team following 2 blocks behind us in a ghost car." The Escalade screeched to a halt half a block away from a rundown, brick apartment building. The street lamps here were shattered, plunging the block into oppressive darkness. "Wait," David said, his hand gripping Barnaby's collar. The dog was suddenly rigid, a deep, vibrating growl rumbling in his throat. Barnaby's ears were pinned back, his eyes locked on the front entrance of the apartment building. "He smells something," David whispered. Through the pouring rain, they saw it. 2 unmarked, dark sedans were parked illegally directly in front of the building. The engines were off, but the faint glow of a dashboard light illuminated the interior of the first car. It was empty. "They beat us here," Victoria hissed, chambering a round into her weapon. "Brody, call up the ghost team. Tell them to lock down the perimeter. Let's move." David didn't wait. He kicked his door open and sprinted into the rain, the Glock gripped tightly in his good hand. Barnaby bolted ahead of him, splashing through the deep puddles, entirely focused on the scent of the intruders. David burst through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, Brody hot on his heels. The lobby was empty, but the elevator dial above the doors was ticking upward, stopping at the 3rd floor. "Stairs!" Brody commanded, pointing to the fire exit door. David took the concrete stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the searing pain radiating from his stitched shoulder. The thought of heavily armed mercenaries near his little girl gave him a surge of adrenaline that completely masked his injuries. Barnaby led the charge, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the concrete steps. As they reached the 3rd floor landing, Barnaby stopped abruptly, throwing his body weight against the heavy fire door. He didn't bark. Instead, he let out a sharp, urgent whine, looking back at David. Brody pushed past David, pressing his ear to the metal door. "I hear voices. They're breaching." Without a word, David grabbed the handle and yanked the heavy door open. The narrow, dimly lit hallway stretched out before them. At the far end, outside apartment 3B, 3 men in plainclothes tactical vests hidden beneath dark windbreakers were gathered. One man had a heavy battering ram poised to strike the wooden door of Mrs. Higgins' apartment. The other 2 had suppressed handguns drawn, ready to flood the room. They weren't just mercenaries. David recognized the stance, the haircuts, the standardized boots. These were corrupt off-duty Seattle PD officers, working directly for Deputy Commissioner Reed. "Hey!" David roared, his voice echoing like thunder down the cramped corridor. The men spun around, shock registering on their faces. The man with the battering ram dropped it, reaching for his holster. "Drop your weapons!" Brody bellowed, raising his own firearm. But Barnaby didn't wait for a negotiation. With a ferocious, terrifying snarl, the 70-pound dog launched himself down the hallway like a furry torpedo. The sheer speed of the animal caught the corrupt cops completely off guard. The closest officer raised his suppressed weapon, aiming at the dog, but Barnaby leaped, his jaws clamping down with bone-crushing force on the man's forearm. The officer screamed, the gun flying from his hand and sliding across the cheap carpet. Barnaby used his momentum to tackle the man to the floor, aggressively pinning him down and snapping viciously at his throat, keeping him entirely incapacitated. "Police! Drop it!" the second officer yelled, aiming at Brody. Brody fired twice. The suppressed pff pff of his weapon was barely audible over the screaming, but the officer dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering away. The third man, the one who had held the battering ram, panicked. He didn't engage Brody or David. Instead, he kicked the door of apartment 3B with all his might. The wood splintered, and the door flew open. He dove inside, desperately seeking a hostage to leverage his way out. "Sarah!" David screamed, pure terror seizing his heart. He sprinted down the hallway, leaping over the bleeding man Barnaby had pinned, and threw himself through the shattered doorway. Inside the small, cluttered living room, the scene was pure chaos. Mrs. Higgins, a frail woman in her 70s, was huddled behind a floral sofa, screaming. The corrupt officer had grabbed 7-year-old Sarah by her pajama shirt, yanking her violently toward his chest. He pressed the barrel of his gun against her temple, his eyes wild and desperate. "Back off!" the officer screamed, his chest heaving. "Drop the gun, or I blow her head off!" Sarah was sobbing, her small hands clutching the man's thick forearm, her terrified eyes locking onto her father. "Daddy!" David froze, his gun raised, his hand trembling violently. He couldn't take the shot. The risk was too high. The man was using Sarah as a human shield, barely exposing an inch of his own head. "Let her go!" David pleaded, his voice cracking, the tough exterior finally shattering. "Take me! Let the little girl go!" Brody stepped into the doorway behind David, his weapon perfectly level, but he too hesitated. The angle was impossible. "I said drop the guns!" the officer shrieked, pressing the barrel harder against Sarah's head. David slowly began to lower his Glock, defeat washing over him in a sickening wave. But the officer had made a fatal miscalculation. He had left the apartment door wide open. Outside in the hallway, Barnaby, having thoroughly subdued his first target, heard the terrified scream of the little girl he had been fiercely protecting for 2 years. The dog's ears perked up, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, primal rage. Before anyone could react, a blur of wet fur and muscle shot through the doorway. Barnaby didn't attack the man's arm or leg. Recognizing the immediate threat to Sarah, the dog leaped off the back of the floral sofa, launching himself directly at the man's face. The officer gasped, instinctively raising his gun hand to swat the massive dog away. It was a split-second distraction, but it was all David needed. As the officer's weapon moved an inch away from Sarah's head to block the dog, David raised his Glock and fired. The loud crack of the unsuppressed 9mm round deafened everyone in the tiny room. The officer's eyes rolled back in his head, his grip instantly releasing Sarah as he collapsed backward onto the floor. Barnaby landed heavily on top of him, but the man was already unconscious, a red bloom expanding rapidly on the shoulder of his windbreaker where David's bullet had struck true. David dropped his gun and fell to his knees. "Sarah!" The little girl scrambled across the floor, throwing her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his chest. David held her so tight he thought he might break her, tears freely mixing with the rain and grime on his face. Barnaby trotted over, shaking the adrenaline from his coat, and gently nuzzled Sarah's back, letting out a soft, comforting whine. Brody quickly moved into the room, kicking the officer's weapon away and zip-tying his hands. He tapped his earpiece. "Miss Sterling, packages secured. But the area is hot. We need immediate exfil." "Understood." Victoria's voice crackled over the radio, tense but steady. "Get them down here. The real police have been tipped off by the gunfire. The block is about to swarm, and we don't know who is clean and who is dirty." David picked Sarah up in his arms, wrapping his bloody jacket around her small shoulders. He looked at Mrs. Higgins, who was shaking violently but unhurt. "Come on, Mary. We're getting you out of here." With Barnaby taking point, the makeshift family hurried out of the shattered apartment, stepping over the groaning mercenaries in the hallway, and rushed down the stairs into the chaotic, rain-swept Seattle night, leaving a trail of shock and ruin in their wake. The armored Escalade smashed through the rain-slicked streets, carrying David, Sarah, Mrs. Higgins, and Barnaby back to the impenetrable fortress of Sterling Tower. Down in the subterranean medical wing, the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving David utterly exhausted but overwhelmingly grateful. He sat on a sterile cot, holding his sleeping daughter tightly against his good shoulder, while Barnaby curled up at their feet, resting his heavy chin on his paws. But Victoria Sterling wasn't resting. The billionaire CEO was operating out of her glass-walled command center on the 52nd floor. With the corrupt faction of the Seattle Police Department severely compromised, she knew she had to bypass local authorities entirely to secure a definitive victory. At 3 a.m., she initiated a secure, encrypted video link directly with the special agent in charge at the FBI's Seattle field office on Spring Street. "I have 3 of your dirty cops zip-tied in an apartment hallway, and 1 mercenary recovering from a severe dog bite in my private medical bay," Victoria told the rigid FBI director, Thomas Harrison, on the screen. She transmitted the encrypted ledgers proving Richard Blackwood's embezzlement, alongside the serial numbers of the defective body armor that had been funneled directly to Deputy Commissioner Sullivan Reed. "They tried to execute me tonight to cover it up. I want them in federal custody before the sun comes up." The trap snapped shut just before dawn. Deputy Commissioner Reed was sitting at his mahogany desk at the downtown precinct, sipping black coffee and nervously waiting for the confirmation of Victoria Sterling's death. Instead, the heavy double doors of his office were violently kicked open by federal agents in dark windbreakers. Reed barely had time to reach for his badge before he was slammed against his own desk and put in handcuffs, his corrupt empire crumbling in seconds. Across town, in a gated Mercer Island mansion, Richard Blackwood was pulled from his silk sheets and dragged out into the freezing rain by an FBI SWAT team. By 8 a.m., the news broke, sending absolute shockwaves through the entire Seattle Police Department. Good, honest cops, completely unaware of the rot at the top of their chain of command, watched in stunned silence as federal indictments were handed down and their boss was paraded out in front of the press. But within the department, the biggest shock wasn't the corruption. It was the tactical operational report detailing exactly how the highly trained, heavily armed hit squad had been neutralized. Word spread through the precinct locker rooms like wildfire. The precinct captain, a 30-year veteran, reviewed the recovered audio and fragmented dashcam footage from Victoria's destroyed cruiser. He watched in awe as David's battered truck slammed into the flanking shooter, and he physically winced as Barnaby launched out the window like a furry missile to take down an assault rifle-wielding mercenary. A tactical squad of ex-military operators had been systematically dismantled by a broke, exhausted shipyard worker and a stray rescue dog. When the crime scene investigators analyzed the skid marks, the shattered glass, and the ballistics at the Sodu ambush site, seasoned detectives simply shook their heads in disbelief. The sheer audacity and raw courage it took for a civilian father to drive into the crossfire instead of away from it defied all logic. Later that afternoon, David sat in Victoria's expansive, sunlit executive office. Sarah was on the plush rug, giggling as Barnaby happily chewed on a new squeaky toy, a stark contrast to the feral, terrifying protector he had been just hours earlier. David's arm was in a sling, his clothes still smelling faintly of gunpowder and rain. Victoria limped into the room, leaning heavily on her aluminum cane, and handed David a thick, sealed manila envelope. "What's this?" David asked, his voice rough. "The mortgage on your house, paid in full," Victoria said, her sharp, aristocratic eyes softening for the first time, "along with a cashier's check that covers every cent of your late wife's medical debt, and a fully funded college trust for Sarah." David stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. The crushing, suffocating weight that had drowned him for 3 years vanished in an instant. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the gold lettering on the billionaire's stationery. "You don't owe me anything, David," Victoria continued, holding up a hand to stop his protests. "You saved my life, and you saved my company. But I do have a selfish request." She looked down at the massive shepherd mix happily thumping his tail on the hardwood floor. "Sterling Defense needs a new director of physical security. Someone who understands loyalty, someone who doesn't flinch under fire, and someone who happens to own the most effective tactical K9 I have ever seen in my life. The starting salary is $300,000 a year. What do you say?" David looked at his daughter, safe and smiling, and then at Barnaby, the stray dog who had rescued him just as much as he had rescued the dog. For the first time in years, David Miller genuinely smiled. The rain finally cleared over Seattle, washing away the blood and corruption of a single, terrifying night. David Miller had driven into the crossfire as a desperate, broken man, but he drove out as a hero. Sometimes, The greatest protectors don't wear badges or tactical gear. Sometimes they are just devoted fathers and loyal rescue dogs, willing to face the darkness to protect the light.
Hi, my name is Shalom Royal Hunger, the owner and manager of Shalom Royal Hunger. After watching the video, single dad ran into gunfire to save a cop. What he and his dog did shocked the entire police force. I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the courage shown in a moment where most people would have frozen in fear. The fact that a single dad and his dog risked themselves to help someone else made the story feel deeply emotional, because it wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about instinct, loyalty, and doing what felt right in a dangerous situation. I think that's what gave the story its strongest impact. Do you think true courage comes from training and experience, or from caring enough about another person to act without hesitation? And why do you think stories about loyalty between humans and animals connect so strongly with people emotionally? I think stories like this remind us that bravery doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply choosing to help when someone else is in danger, even when it would be easier to walk away. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories about courage, loyalty, and unexpected heroes, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.